The sign, weathered and almost illegible, declared, "Clear Lake, gateway to serenity." Serenity, Sarah thought, seemed a far cry from the oppressive stillness that hung in the air. The sun, a pale disk behind a veil of low-hanging clouds, cast long, distorted shadows across the empty main street. Clear Lake was a town suspended in time, a place where the past lingered like a damp, clinging fog. Sarah pulled her battered Jeep Wrangler to a stop in front of the Clear Lake Historical Society, a small brick building that looked as if it had been transplanted from a bygone era. She had driven for hours, the flat, monotonous landscape of upstate New York giving way to rolling hills, and then finally the expanse of Clear Lake itself. The lake, a vast, dark mirror reflecting the somber sky, dominated the horizon. Its sheer size was unsettling, the far shore barely visible through the haze. Her mission was simple: research the history of Hollow Creek, a town that had been submerged decades ago to create the lake. A historical oddity, a footnote in the region's past that had always intrigued her. She'd always been drawn to places where stories lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Inside the Historical Society, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. A lone figure, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, sat behind a large, cluttered desk. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "I'm Sarah Miller," Sarah said, extending her hand. "I'm here to research Hollow Creek." The woman's eyes flickered with a hint of something Sarah couldn't quite place. Perhaps apprehension, perhaps pity. "Hollow Creek," she repeated, her gaze drifting towards the window and the expanse of the lake. "A long time ago, that was. I understand it was flooded to create the reservoir," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook. "Yes," the woman said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Flooded. Like it never existed at all." Sarah spent the next few hours poring over old newspaper clippings and faded photographs. The stories were scant, but they painted a picture of a vibrant, close-knit community lost beneath the cold, indifferent waters of the lake. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, she noticed an older gentleman watching her from across the room. Sheriff Brody, she would soon come to know him as. He had a look about him, a warmness that told of a man who had seen too much. "You know, some say those folks never truly left," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a low rumble. Sarah looked up, a skeptical eyebrow raised. "Left where?" He nodded towards the lake. "Down there." The next morning, the lake was shrouded in a thick grey mist, giving it an ethereal, almost otherworldly appearance. Sarah decided to explore the areas where the old town's ruins occasionally surfaced when the water level dropped. She rented a small kayak from a local outfitter and paddled out, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of the water against the hull. As she moved closer to the center of the lake, the mist seemed to thicken, creating a disorienting white void. Then she saw it. The skeletal remains of what looked like a church steeple, a dark, jagged finger pointing towards the sky. She paddled closer, her heart pounding. Submerged just beneath the murky surface, she could make out the outlines of buildings, streets, the ghost of a town lost to time. It was a surreal sight, a glimpse into a forgotten world. She felt a strange pull, an inexplicable connection to this place. As she drifted over what appeared to be the town square, she noticed a glint of metal in the mud. Reaching into the cold water, she retrieved a small, tarnished silver locket. She opened it, revealing two faded photographs. A young woman with a gentle smile and a stern-looking man in a suit. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just the cold water. There was something else, an unsettling presence that seemed to emanate from the depths of the lake. She suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she were being watched by unseen eyes. That night, Sarah's dreams were plagued by vivid images of Hollow Creek. She saw faces, distorted and pale, their eyes filled with a haunting sadness. She heard whispers, unintelligible words that seemed to echo from the depths of her subconscious. She dreamt of rushing water, of screams, of a town being swallowed whole. She woke with a start, her heart racing, the sheets damp with sweat. The room was dark, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of fabric or the soft padding of bare feet. She sat up, her eyes straining to pierce the darkness. A shadow moved across the wall, a fleeting silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Sarah held her breath, her senses on high alert. Was it her imagination, or was something else in the room with her? She reached for the lamp on her bedside table, her hand trembling. As she flicked the switch, the room was flooded with light, revealing nothing but the empty space. But the lingering sense of unease remained, a cold, icy dread that settled deep in her bones. The morning brought no relief from the unease that had settled over Sarah. She decided to seek out Sheriff Brody, hoping he could shed some light on the strange occurrences. She found him at the local diner, a small, cozy place where the scent of strong coffee and fried eggs filled the air. "Sheriff," she said, sliding into the booth opposite him, "I wanted to ask you about the legends surrounding Hollow Creek." He looked up, his eyes weary. "Legends or truths?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Around here we've learned to respect the old stories." He recounted tales of restless spirits, of the drowned town's inhabitants seeking vengeance for their stolen lives. He spoke of strange lights appearing on the lake at night, of eerie whispers carried on the wind, and of those who had ventured too close to the water's edge, never to return. "They say the lake remembers," he said, his voice low. "And it doesn't forget." Later that day, Sarah decided to visit the Evans family. Their house, a modern two-story structure, sat on a hill overlooking the lake. As she approached, she noticed a palpable tension in the air. "We've been having some problems," Mrs. Evans said, her voice strained as she led Sarah into the living room. Things moving on their own, strange noises, cold spots. Their teenage son, Mike, showed her a series of unexplained scratches on his arm. "It feels like something's trying to hurt us," he said, his voice trembling. Sarah examined the house, noting the unsettling chill in certain rooms and the strange, almost metallic scent that lingered in the air. She found nothing concrete, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Back in her motel room, Sarah delved deeper into her research. She found old newspaper articles detailing the construction of the dam and the forced evacuation of Hollow Creek. The stories painted a grim picture of broken promises and broken lives. The townspeople had been promised new homes and a brighter future, but many had been left destitute, their ancestral lands flooded, their livelihoods destroyed. She found a particularly disturbing account from a local journalist detailing the sudden and unexplained rise in the lake's water level during the final days of the evacuation. Many had been caught off guard, their homes flooded before they could retrieve their belongings, some even losing their lives in the sudden surge. The words seemed to jump off the page, an echo of the rage that surely still lurked beneath the lake's surface. A cold draft swept through the room, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. She looked up, but saw nothing. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Sarah returned to the Evans home the following morning. She needed to understand the connection between their experiences and the history of Hollow Creek. As she approached, she noticed a police car parked in the driveway. Sheriff Brody was talking to Mr. Evans, his expression grim. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "Mike," Mr. Evans said, his voice shaking. "He went out on the lake early this morning, said he wanted to take some pictures. His kayak overturned. We found him shivering, soaking wet, claiming something pulled him under. Sarah felt a chill run through her. This was no coincidence. The lake was sending a message. She spoke with Mike, who was wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide with fear. It was like hands, he stammered, cold, strong hands. They grabbed me, pulled me down. I saw faces in the water, pale faces staring up at me. Sarah decided to conduct her own investigation. She returned to the lake, launching her kayak and paddling towards the area where Mike's kayak had overturned. The water was unusually murky, even for Clear Lake. She trailed her hand in the water, feeling the cold seep into her bones. Suddenly, she felt a tug, a gentle pull on her arm. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. She scanned the water but saw nothing. Then she noticed something shimmering just beneath the surface, a silver chain glinting in the pale sunlight. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. As she pulled the chain up, a locket emerged from the murky depths. It was identical to the one she'd found earlier, but this one was engraved with the initials TH. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she felt a presence, an unseen entity close by. She looked around, but the mist had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. She felt a coldness creeping up her spine, a sense of dread that intensified with each passing moment. Then she heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the depths of the lake. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a primal sound of rage and sorrow. The water began to churn, and dark shapes moved beneath. The surface, swirling around her kayak. Sarah paddled frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get back to shore, away from the malevolent presence that lurked beneath the surface. As she reached the shore, she looked back at the lake. The mist had dissipated, revealing the calm, undisturbed surface of the water. But Sarah knew better. The lake was alive, and it was watching. Back in her motel room, Sarah laid out the two lockets on the table. The initials TH matched those she'd seen in the old newspaper articles, belonging to Thomas Hollow, the town's former mayor, who had tragically drowned during the flood. The other locket, with the initials AE, remained a mystery. But a dreadful suspicion began to form. She decided to revisit the Clear Lake Historical Society. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Gable, was surprised to see her back so late. "I need to see any records you have on the engineers who built the dam," Sarah said, her voice urgent. Mrs. Gable frowned, but retrieved a dusty folder from a back room. Inside, Sarah found a list of names, and one stood out: Arthur Evans. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Evans family were descendants of the man responsible for the flooding of Hollow Creek. She raced to the Evans home, her mind reeling. The house was dark, but she saw a light in the back. She found Mrs. Evans in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "Sarah, thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice trembling. "Things have gotten so much worse. We hear them now, all the time, whispering, scratching. It's like they're in the walls." Suddenly, a loud crash came from upstairs. They both ran to Mike's room. He was huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with terror. A dark, viscous substance dripped from the ceiling, staining the carpet. "They showed me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They showed me what they went through." Sarah retrieved the old journal and began to read aloud some of the most harrowing accounts. The sudden artificial raising of the water levels, done to accelerate the project, had caught many residents off guard. Homes were submerged rapidly and without warning. Livestock drowned. People were forced to flee in the middle of the night in the rain, and many did not make it. As Sarah read, the room grew colder. The air crackled with energy. The dripping from the ceiling increased, taking on a reddish tinge. The walls seemed to vibrate. Then words began to appear on the walls, written in the dripping substance. "Revenge. You took everything. Now you pay," Mrs. Evans screamed. Mike began to sob. Sarah felt a wave of nausea, a sense of overwhelming dread. They were not just witnessing the ghost's anger. They were reliving it. Suddenly, a photograph slid out of the journal, an image of Arthur Evans and a group of other engineers. On the back, in faded ink, was a note: "Progress requires sacrifice. Some sacrifices are greater than others." Sarah knew then that she was no mere observer. She was connected, by blood, to the events that had condemned Hollow Creek. The spirits knew, and they were ready to make her pay for her ancestors' sins. The air in the Evans home was thick with dread. The spectral writing on the wall pulsed with a malevolent light, and the dripping from the ceiling formed disturbing, almost recognizable shapes. Sarah, her mind racing, knew they had to get away, but she also knew they were trapped. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Now." As they moved toward the front door, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. A chilling wind swept through the hallway, and the sound of rushing water filled the air as if the lake itself had invaded their home. The front door slammed shut, and the windows rattled violently. "They won't let us leave," Mrs. Evans whispered, her voice filled with terror. Suddenly, Mike screamed. A dark, shadowy figure had emerged from his room, its form shifting and indistinct, but its eyes glowed with an eerie light. It reached out, its spectral hand passing through Mike's chest, causing him to collapse to the floor, gasping for air. "Mike!" Mrs. Evans cried, rushing to his side. Sarah knew she had to do something. She grabbed the journal and the lockets, her only weapons against the spectral onslaught. She stepped forward, facing the shadowy figure. "You want revenge," she said, her voice echoing through the darkness. "But you're hurting innocent people. They had nothing to do with what happened." The figure seemed to pause, its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. Then a voice, cold and hollow, echoed through the house. "You carry the blood of the betrayers. You are no different." "I am different," Sarah retorted. "I want to understand. I want to make amends." She opened the journal and began to read aloud, her voice trembling but determined. She read the names of the drowned, the stories of their lost lives, the accounts of their suffering. She read of Thomas Hollow, the mayor, who had fought for his town, only to be betrayed and drowned. As she read, the shadowy figure seemed to waver, its form flickering. The spectral writing on the walls began to fade, and the dripping from the ceiling slowed. The sound of rushing water subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Then the voice returned, but this time it was softer, filled with a haunting sadness. "You see our pain," it whispered, "but it cannot be undone." "I know," Sarah said, "but we can honor your memory. We can tell your story. We can make sure your suffering was not in vain." She held out the lockets. "These belong to your people," she said. "They are part of your story. I want to return them." The shadowy figure reached out, its spectral hand closing around the lockets. Then it turned, and with a final, mournful sigh, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness. The spectral writing on the wall disappeared completely, and the dripping from the ceiling ceased. The lights flickered back on, revealing the room, now still and silent. Mike was still unconscious, but breathing steadily. Mrs. Evans sat beside him, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. Sarah knew the confrontation was not truly over, but a fragile peace had been won for now. The next morning, the Evans house was quiet, the air no longer thick with malevolence. Mike had regained consciousness, weak but otherwise unharmed. The events of the night before had left a deep impression on them, a chilling reminder of the past's enduring power. Sarah decided it was time to leave Clear Lake. The town, with its lingering shadows and haunted waters, had served its purpose. She packed her belongings, the silver lockets resting carefully in her bag, and prepared to say goodbye. She stopped by the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. "It's time," Sarah replied, "but I wanted to thank you for your stories, your warnings." "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "I found more than I bargained for," she said. "I found a story that needs to be told." She recounted the events of the past few days, the ghostly encounters, the revelations about Hollow Creek, the confrontation with the vengeful spirits. Sheriff Brody listened intently, his expression never wavering. "Some things are best left undisturbed," he said finally, "but I suppose some stories demand to be heard." Sarah nodded. "I believe they do." Before leaving town, she returned to the lake one last time. The mist had lifted and the sun shone brightly on the water, turning it into a shimmering expanse of blue. But Sarah knew the peace was deceptive. The lake still held its secrets, its memories, its ghosts. She took the lockets from her bag and walked to the water's edge. Holding them out, she whispered, "May you find peace." She gently tossed the lockets into the lake. They sank slowly, disappearing into the depths. As they vanished, Sarah felt a sense of closure, a weight lifted from her shoulders. As she drove away from Clear Lake, she knew she would never forget the town beneath the water, the lives lost, the stories buried. She had faced the ghosts of Hollow Creek, and in doing so, she had found a way to honor their memory. She would carry their story with her, a reminder that the past, however deeply submerged, always finds a way to surface.